Okay, so, we get some pretty interesting questions here at the deep dive. But this one that one of you sent in really got us thinking.
Yeah.
It's about predictions for the future of the world.
Big topic, right?
Yeah. And what's so interesting about this one is the source material. Um,
Yeah.
it's not every day that we get to dive into an audio excerpt that talks about the predictions of the late Brazilian medium Chico Xavier, right alongside some really interesting conversations from a ufology conference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for anyone listening, it's really important for us to be clear about what we're doing here, right? We're
Right.
not trying to say any of these predictions are definitely true or false or anything like that.
Hmm.
We're approaching this more like a puzzle, you know?
Yeah.
What are these different sources actually saying? What are the connections? Where do they overlap? And what are some of the big ideas that come up in this kind of,
Right. Yeah,
discussions?
yeah, you're curious. We're curious, so let's explore together.
Yeah.
Okay, so in this material, we're looking at a few different threads. First, we have Chico Xavier's predictions about a potential conflict in the Northern Hemisphere and how that might affect the Southern Hemisphere.
Hmm.
Then we have some similar ideas from a medium in Buenos Aires focusing specifically on Argentina.
Right?
And then adding another layer, there's a Mexican researcher who had a vision of a meteor hitting Italy.
Wow.
And last but not least, we have the perspective of ufologist Ricardo Gonzalez, who talks about extraterrestrials preparing for some sort of celestial event.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. So let's start with Chico Xavier.
Okay, so the audio excerpt that we have talks about this prediction from Chico Xavier, and it predicts a serious risk of nuclear war that would really hit the Northern Hemisphere hard.
Okay.
And the result of that would be a huge movement of people who survived the catastrophe heading south towards the Southern Hemisphere.
Okay.
And the places that are specifically mentioned are Brazil, Australia, and South Africa.
And it's interesting that there was a specific time frame attached to this initially, right? The audio mentions a period leading up to July 2019, the 50th anniversary of the moon landing.
Right.
It makes you wonder why that date was so important.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it shows how these predictions often have these specific timeframes attached to them.
Yeah.
But what I find really interesting is that this idea of a major crisis in the north and a shift to the south kind of pops up in other more recent accounts as well.
Right.
So the audio goes on to talk about a ufology congress that happened in Argentina in January 2023.
Yes. And at this Congress, a presenter from Buenos Aires shared some predictions from another local medium.
Mm-hmm.
And this medium also predicted a significant migration from the Northern Hemisphere to South America. But this time, the time frame was a bit later, around 2027.
Okay.
However, this prediction adds a bit of a twist. It suggests that these new arrivals would basically take over the continent.
It's a strong image, right?
Yeah, it is.
But if we think about it in connection to that earlier prediction about the Northern Hemisphere crisis,
Hmm.
you can see how there's this recurring theme of anxiety about the North and a potential change in demographics in the South.
Absolutely. And then the narrative kind of takes another turn when we hear about this personal vision that a Mexican researcher had.
Oh, right.
So this researcher shared their experience with the speakers in the audio, and apparently they had this vision of a meteor hitting Italy, also around the year 2027.
Oh, wow.
Now, it's really important to point out, and the audio does this as well, that this is presented as a personal vision,
Right.
not a channeled prediction like we saw with Chico Xavier or the medium in Buenos Aires.
Yeah,
It's a different kind of insight altogether.
it is. And it makes you think, how do we even compare these different kinds of glimpses into the future, right? We
Yeah.
have these channeled messages, we have personal visions, and then the audio introduces the perspective of Ricardo Gonzalez.
Right, Ricardo Gonzalez is a big name in the ufology community.
Yeah.
He's a self-identified contactee,
Yeah.
which means that he claims to have had direct contact and experiences with extraterrestrials.
Mm-hmm.
And in his case, these beings are called Apunians.
Okay, and he's originally from Peru, but has been living in Argentina for a while, right?
That's right.
Okay.
So according to the audio, Gonzalez says that the Apunians have been communicating with him, and they've told him that they're actively preparing the Earth for a celestial impact that's supposed to happen sometime in the 2020s.
Wow.
So you can kind of see how this idea of a meteor starts to gain some momentum in these different sources.
Yeah.
We've got the Buenos Aires medium predicting this catastrophe in the north,
Yeah.
the Mexican researcher's vision of a meteor in Italy, and then Gonzalez talking about the Apunians preparing for a celestial event.
Right.
And all of this is happening around the same time frame, the mid to late 2020s. So it makes sense that someone might connect those dots.
Absolutely. And what I find really fascinating is how the audio tries to connect these more recent predictions with the work of Chico Xavier.
Right.
So they bring up the book A Camino de Luz by Emmanuel, which was psychographed by Chico Xavier way back in 1938.
And for those who might not know, the term psychographed means that the writing is attributed to a spirit, in this case Emmanuel, and transcribed by the medium Chico Xavier.
Right.
And this book apparently predicts that Europe would suffer a lot, that it
Mm.
would be decimated.
Wow.
And this is where the audio really emphasizes the idea of taking information from different sources, even from very different time periods, and seeing if you can put together a bigger, more complete picture,
Yeah.
like looking for a pattern across decades of these insights.
Yeah, it's like a historical puzzle.
It is.
It really shows just how complex it is to try to interpret these kinds of predictions or visions, right? You have to
Sure.
think about the original context, the specific language that's used, the time period. It's all really important.
Yeah.
So then the audio moves on to another well-known prediction from Chico Xavier, this time from a 1971 TV program called Pingafogo.
Yes. On that program, Chico Xavier, again, through Emmanuel, predicted that the Earth would become a regenerated world by the year 2057. So that's a really interesting long-term perspective when you consider all this talk about upheaval in the near future.
It is, and the speaker in the audio makes this really good point.
Mm-hmm.
They say that from the perspective of 1971, 2057 probably seemed like a really long time away.
Right.
But from where we are now, it's actually within the lifetime of many people listening to this.
Oh, that's true.
And that leads to a discussion about the potential for some big changes in human consciousness and values.
Which brings us to this really interesting concept of despertadores, which means awakening devices.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea here is that maybe humanity doesn't always evolve in a smooth, gradual way.
Right.
Maybe sometimes it takes some really big, even challenging or painful event to really shake us up and make us change our priorities, you know,
Yeah.
to move away from just focusing on material things and towards something more spiritual or interconnected.
Right.
Makes you think, what kind of awakening could these predictions be pointing to, if any at all?
Yeah. It's a lot to consider.
Yeah.
So as you're taking all of this in, what are some of the main things that stand out to you?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that we're dealing with predictions and interpretations here,
Right.
not facts that are set in stone.
Absolutely. But there are some recurring themes that we see popping up across these different sources.
Yeah.
There's this constant worry about global instability starting in the Northern Hemisphere.
Hmm.
The mid to late 2020s seem to be a focal point in a lot of these predictions.
Right.
And then if we look further ahead, there's this overarching vision of a future Earth that has gone through a major transformation, a regenerated world.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth remembering just how much work Chico Xavier did in his lifetime.
Right.
To really understand any one of his predictions, you would probably need to dive deep into his writings and all of his psychographed messages.
Absolutely.
And it's natural to try and connect the dots between what different mediums and contactees are saying,
Yeah.
but we have to admit that when we do that, we're speculating. Each source has its own unique perspective and way of interpreting things.
Yeah.
Our goal here has been to explore what these sources are saying and how they relate to each other, not to say whether any specific prediction is true or false.
So to wrap things up, we've looked at this scenario of conflict and migration, the time frame of the mid to late 2020s, which seems to be connected to potential Earth changes and societal shifts, and this long-term view of a regenerated planet by 2057.
Right. And all of that leads to a final thought for you all to consider.
Mm-hmm.
These different perspectives on potential future challenges and transformations. This idea that big societal shifts might be on the horizon, and that difficult events could actually push us to reevaluate our priorities. What does all this make you think about where the world is heading and the potential for change?
It really encourages us to think about the deeper meaning behind these predictions without necessarily saying for sure what the future holds.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into some really fascinating and thought-provoking material.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then. Bye.